Okay, so this is the fourth of the series of talks on archetypes in the middle way. I'm just going to start by briefly recapping the first three to give us a little bit of context. So the first talk was about archetypes and embodied meaning. And there I talked about how symbols that have an archetypal function work by being associated with our embodied experience. So the idea that meaning is embodied is a big part of the perspective being discussed here, which needs to be understood at the start. Then second talk was about the distinction between meaning and belief, which is also crucial for understanding the approach, really, the approach to archetypes in the middle way here. So meaning, which is embodied, is a separate thing from belief, rather than, or can be a separate thing from belief, rather than meaning being seen in terms of belief, which is much more common in the way people tend to think about these things. So that will be crucial, particularly for this this session, to apply this to religion. The idea that religion provides meaning, and that's distinguishable from religious beliefs. Third talk was about inspiration specifically, and the idea that archetypes function for us by providing inspiration. And inspiration is an associative process by which we reconnect with our deeper long-term motives. So the function of archetypes, I'm arguing, is to provide inspiration of a particular kind we need as humans, because we have this tendency towards falling into conflicts, which we need to overcome by maintaining longer-term motivations. And I discussed there 4 types of such inspiration, which correspond to 4 major archetypes. Okay, so through those 3 initial talks, religion has kept coming up in one way or another. It is a crucial sort of application of what I'm talking about throughout, but I thought it would be good to have a talk specifically about it to focus on it a bit more. So broadly understood, that is, if one understands religion in a broad enough way, I think it provides the most important forms of archetypal inspiration for humankind. Elsewhere, perhaps in my book, I've talked about religion as the practice of integrating the archetypes, which I suppose is a development of what Jung said about it. And Jung talked about expressing the archetypes. I think we could possibly go even further than that. But much of the discourse about religion is unhelpful, I think, because it doesn't make any distinction between meaning and belief. And it tends to be obsessed with beliefs in one way or another, absolute beliefs. So I'm going to, there are 5 sort of areas I want to talk about here in this talk. First is what religion is, how we can understand what religion is, to which my short answer is a living system, I think. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the relationship between religion and other kinds of tradition. So I don't think we should have too hard and fast boundaries on what we think is religion. Thirdly, I'll talk more about how inspiring archetypal symbols can be embedded in religion, but also how they get hijacked, turned into absolute beliefs. Then, the follow-up practice focus this time involves 2 elements, and that's finding inspiration in our personal religious heritage and the practice of agnosticism to avoid getting sucked into the conflicts around religious dogma. So I am going to talk about both of those 2 things towards the end of the talk today to provide a bit more background to what I think is meant by those two things, those two aspects of practice, let's say. Okay, but in order to get onto that, I think it's important to talk about a bit more generally first about how we can most helpfully see religion, how we can understand it most helpfully. Yeah, a lot of ways of defining religion, the ones you'll find in dictionaries and a lot of textbooks are belief-based and very linear, I think. But I want to understand religion very much in the same terms that I'd want to understand an ecosystem, for example, or the systems that make up you or I. That is, yeah, to understand it systemically as a set of relationships. And obviously, religion as a system is extended over time, but all systems are extended over time, but that's particularly important in religion. And it's made up of human cultural relationships. Yeah, rather than sort of having a prescriptive and essentialized definition of religion, I think one of the most helpful ways of approaching it have been what are called phenomenological, that is, by looking at the phenomena that people call religious and just analyzing, well, what seems to be involved in what do we call religion. The guy who did that most famously back in the 1960s and 70s was Ninian Smart, who was a professor of religion at religious studies at Lancaster, and he analysed 7 dimensions of religion. Now I've got a diagram, hopefully, which I can share with you. Just find it. Yep. Okay, so this diagram, there's a little picture of Ninian Smart at the bottom there with his bow tie. So it's very much this 1960s professor who helped to pioneer religious studies as distinct from theology at Lancaster, which was a centre for that. His 7 dimensions there. If we start on the left-hand side, the experiential, that is religious experience, in the broadest sense of the term, yeah. So he also talked about, you know, experiences of dread or experiences of guilt or whatever, as well as experiences of inspiration through religious experience. But I would particularly want to talk about archetypal inspiration, reminding us of experiences that have kept us motivated over time and give us a wider perspective. So you can see religious experience in the broadest sense, positive religious experience anyway, is doing that. Religious experience, was a crucial part of his perspective. The mythic or narrative dimension of religion, a lot of stories. Obviously, the Bible is basically a book of stories, for instance. So is the Pali Canon. Well, most of it. Ritual, of course, of various kinds, whether it's rites of passage or church services or pujas or whatever. Material element of religion, the buildings, fairly obviously, like churches or temples or whatever, but also things like works of art, any perhaps sacred object or any object which is used or involved in religion. Social aspect, the community of people who practice a religion and identify with it. The ethical aspect, so the way that people apply ideals to their lives to try and lead them differently in a religious context. And the doctrinal dimension, which is the bit people tend to focus on most, which is the beliefs associated with religion. Okay, but so what's particularly useful about this, I think, is just that it reminds us of just what a rich thing religion is. You know, when you start looking at what's involved in a religion, what people generally call a religion, belief is at most a seventh of it. You know, it's there's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot more aspects of experience involved. Okay, so now if we try and see religion in that way, yeah, that is by almost, as it were, looking at what has been called religious and trying to be open in the way we interpret them and identify the helpful as well as the unhelpful aspects of religion. Then I think we can see religion as a set of traditions, really, or we see interlinked, complex traditions, and those traditions pass on the different resources involved in those dimensions. So whether it's the buildings or the doctrines or the ethical codes or whatever. Passing things on and making resources available to future generations is obviously a crucial aspect of religion. So that's one reason why I often sort of clarify when people talk about religion. I often want to clarify that by just using the word tradition in addition to the term religion. So to talk about, for example, Christian tradition or Buddhist tradition, and that just makes it clear that we're talking about this kind of system working through time. Okay, but of course, that system can be hijacked, which is why we end up with this common perception that religion is defined by belief, by absolute belief specifically. And that hijacking process, I think, can be traced. If you look at the work of people like Ian McGilchrist on the brain hemispheres, it can be associated most basically with the overdominance of left hemisphere operation. And that's expressed socially as power. So the left hemisphere is manipulative. It tends to adopt fixed ideas of what is the case, what are the facts, what are expressed in religious terms as beliefs, absolute beliefs about things. And those are then identified with by a group of people, and getting everybody to believe the same thing has this tremendous value as a source of power. So get everybody to identify with particular absolute beliefs which are not open to scrutiny. They can then easily be used to maintain social power of different kinds. So that's associated also with the projection of archetypes. So assuming that archetypes, they're not a process that works for us, but rather they're a thing out there. So for example, God is this supernatural entity separate from the processes that we engage in. So that's all part of what I'd see as the hijacking or projection of religion, or the absolutizing of religion. And when religion gets absolutized, its diachronic aspect, that is, it's moving through time, its tradition working through time, tends to get ignored. So the past and present and future experience that are linked together by our recollections and inspirations from archetypes tend to just get appropriated to shorter term desires and beliefs, which are served by the absolute beliefs of the religion. And of course, those who maintain that hijacked view of religion want to support that through the whole way and actually understand what religion is. So hence I think that's why religion has been so often understood in essentialized terms. So the idea that either religion in general or a specific religion in say Christianity or Buddhism or whatever must be defined in a particular way according to the absolute beliefs of that particular influential people in that tradition. So hence the belief, even amongst those who don't subscribe to religious beliefs, that it must be absolutizing by definition. And that's what I think we need to get away from, get beyond. So that's a little bit about how I want to understand religion in general. And perhaps I should stress that this is just what I think is the most helpful approach, as far as I can see, to religion. If we adopt this approach, it connects in with all sorts of other practices, which one can understand in terms of the middle way. Another concern, maybe thing to clear up really, is the relationship between religion and other types of tradition, because if you adopt an essentialized view of religion, then you're very likely to say, well, religion is what happens in this particular sphere, it's defined in this particular way, and it's not happening in this other place. Yeah, so you can make a clear distinction between religion and secularity, secularity being what's either not part of religion or is at least neutral to it in some sense. And the arts, for example, are then seen as secular, or at least the idea that they can be secular. Science is seen as secular or even as opposed to religion. But it seems to me that when we see religion as a phenomenon working through time, sort of bearing the archetypes, we cannot make these rigid boundaries around what we consider to be religion. And perhaps that comes home if you start thinking in terms of inspiring archetypes and the way those same archetypes are also found in all sorts of other places. And I think in the modern context, that has become more and more the case. So we find our archetypal inspirations as much in, for example, artistic expression, political ideals, all other kinds of secular so-called ideals than we do in religious ones. But that doesn't mean they're not archetypal and that they don't have a basic similarity of function with religious archetypes. So any group with long-term goals and values really can develop a culture which includes archetypal symbols, and those symbols help to motivate people over time. So political traditions would be quite a good one to start with. Think of ideological traditions like socialism or liberalism or conservatism or green politics. Yeah, so they've all got so they're rather looser things than religions, you might argue, but they do have a lot of the same ideals which have an archetypal function. So think of the role of justice for socialists, for example. That justice is kind of a concept that socialists will keep coming back to, that inspires them to carry on fighting for justice in the world. You can also get in political traditions in groups that represent people, like unions, for example, or in campaign groups. But there are many other kinds of such traditions that have archetypal functions. So economic traditions like businesses, scientific tradition, which passes on scientific method and traditions of scrutiny in science. Any academic discipline basically has its own traditions of that kind. Artistic schools and traditions. So one of those that I've particularly involved in personally is classical piano training. Yeah, so there's a whole set of expectations there and ideals about how you will perform on the piano, and then basically any other organized practice with standards, so crafts, sports, medicine, there's all kinds of aspects of archetypal symbols in those. So it's hardly surprising really that some of these traditions and practices clearly develop all the features of religion. So sometimes people have speculated, for example, or asked, is football a religion? And football, if you look at those 7 dimensions from Ninny and Smart, you could make a good case for football having all of them, I think. It has doctrines in its rules and so on. It has ethics. It has communities, certainly of supporters and teams and so on. It has material stuff, stadiums and so on. It has rituals. Of course, the match is a big ritual. It has stories about great heroes of football, and it has experiences, the exaltation of the fans, the engagement in the game. Yeah. So, is football a religion? Well, why not? It just shows that there were no clear boundaries to religion. There's a fade out. And in the last part of my book, Archetypes in Religion and Beyond, well, this is the beyond bit. I talk about 8 different, so supposedly secular concepts. I'm afraid I have to put secular in inverted commas, but so 8 concepts which I think are widely used in an archetypal way, but are often not considered religious. So these are nature, goodness, truth, beauty, rationality, humanity, democracy, and health. And that's just a selection of the wide range of concepts that we tend to use in that way, I think. Sometimes they're not just concepts. So sometimes you get statues which are allegories of nature, for example, or truth, whatever you take. Truth tends to be a naked woman for some reason, for example. Yeah. So these things represent those qualities that we are trying to develop. But of course, all those supposedly non-religious concepts can also be projected and absolutized in the same way that religious ones can. So if you think about the commercialization of so-called natural products, or the loose way people talk about rationality, so there's loads of examples of that. Okay, so religion is not such an easily limited thing. But of course, if we accept that argument, then that also kind of interferes with the idea that secularity can easily be defined as well, which is why I'm so skeptical about secularity, I'm afraid. Anyway, so going on. So let's go back to particularly how inspiring archetypal symbols can be embedded in religion, and how religion might help the inspiration to be passed on or to be accessed. Yeah. So this is the particular helpful function of religion, perhaps. So basically, as I see it, the archetypes take a cultural form in religious traditions and indeed in other traditions as symbols. I think this goes back to the first talk where I particularly stressed that an archetype and a symbol are not the same thing and should not be confused with each other. Yes, so the archetype is the function served by the symbol, if you like. Hence, for example, the distinction between God, say, is a particular symbol, maybe a particular view of God, and the God archetype, which is a much wider thing. It's basically a symbol which has the function of putting us in touch with a wider potentiality of some kind. So we all need those archetypal symbols in some way to be available to us, to inspire us, and religions make them available. Yeah, so that seems to be the business of religion primarily, to provide us with inspiring symbols, as long as they don't get to project it, perhaps. Remember that by the term symbol here, I don't just mean visual symbols. I also mean words and stories and so on, and also music. So obviously a lot of this is done through words and even through concepts, as well as through artistic symbols. So these symbols are constantly evolving. I mean, there's continuity, but there's also constantly new forms in the way the archetypes are expressed in their symbols. So if you just think about, say, Christ as a symbol in Christianity, all the different specific forms that Christ has taken in different denominations, different times, different roles that appeals to Christ has taken. So even where there's a lot of continuity, there's also a lot of change as well. So we get new narratives, new rituals, new moral expectations in different times, new doctrines, new social groupings, artistic depictions, new sacred objects. These all keep evolving, and they need to keep evolving in order to keep providing inspiration in new situations. So the continuity is maintain that archetypal function. If the religion is working, as it were, then it helps to maintain that function, but the changes allow them to adapt and to work in different contexts. So those symbolic forms help to prompt individuals when they encounter those symbols. Now, of course, a lot of religions focus primarily on the God archetype in one way or another. So even if the focus is something like nature or enlightenment or something of that kind, I think that still fulfills the same basic function. But there's the openness to new experiences, but there are also the other three archetypal functions, which are also important in religious traditions. So you also get the hero function having a big role in religions, for example. So Buddha and Christ are just as much heroes as they are God-like figures. So those inspire us to persevere in our pursuit of a goal. There's also the development and maintaining of relationships with others, maybe different from us. So that's how I see the animus archetype. Hence the wide range of such figures, particularly feminine figures in religion, which are primarily directed at men. And of course, avoiding threats. So the shadow also figures largely in religion, Satan or Mara or whatever. Okay, so that's kind of, I think, the positive process, which we could trace in virtually any religious tradition. That doesn't mean that any religious tradition does that equally well, but that's where I'd see the value that we hopefully could find in any religious tradition to some extent. But I've already mentioned the hijacking of those traditions. So that's done through the hijacking of those symbols through projection. So when the symbol gets shifted into a over-dominant left hemisphere approach, then the openness to new experiences, that's really crucial for us to engage with the God archetype, for example. So the open to new potentialities, open to new experiences. Yeah, you've really got to maintain a connection to your right hemisphere in order to feel that, for that to be relevant to you. but that instantly gets flattened, objectified, commodified, deadened almost in the left hemisphere based concept, or solely left hemisphere based concept. So the problem isn't that the left hemisphere is involved, and indeed that it might be highly active, but that there's no context, there isn't sufficient linkage to the right hemisphere and its perspective. So what started off as a genuine inspiration becomes kind of fake inspiration. The metaphor becomes a dead metaphor, will be another way of putting that. So instead of the experience of archetypal inspiration, we get the sharing of dogmas. There are also even ways of kind of substituting for religious experience of a more challenging nature, which is, for lack of a better term, I tend to call hysteria, or hysterical types of religious experience. I know there are problems with the word hysteria, but find me a better word and I'll use it. But yeah, think of some of the things that go on in Pentecostalist churches, for example. So people getting very excited in groups and being bound in their groups through that shared excitement. But it's not the kind of inspiration which is opening them to new possibilities so much as binding them together in the power of that group experience, I think. Okay, so once started, I think this sort of flattening or substitution of the real inspiration, this gets maintained by religious institutions because it supports power, and it offers a shortcut to group conformity, which is obviously of great facility for those who want to exert power. And traditional dogmas then get substituted for actual inspiration, and it's those that get passed on rather than the line of inspiration. But I don't want to convey an unnecessarily negative view of what goes on in any religious context, such as a church service, for instance. So what goes on in a typical religious context, even in a highly dogmatic type of religion, I think tends to be a mixture of effective and projected archetypal function in varying proportions. So it's quite surprising, if you read some accounts of sociological accounts, for example, of what happens in fundamentalist groups, how much there is going on, and how complex it is, and how they do manage to find inspiration despite the heavy use of dogma to bind the group. So even in the most repressive groups, we might be surprised at how much inspiration actually may go on as well. And of course, even in very progressive open groups, you can also get dogmas creeping in. So the complexity of the mixture means, of course, that people often stay committed, even if they are failing to get inspiration from religion, because they're still in hope of genuine archetypal function, and they might keep getting indications from time to time, that it's really available, and maybe they even find it. So it's a complex situation. Okay, so that's kind of general survey of how I think we can helpfully approach religion. But I'm now going to just focus on the more practical implications of applying that in two different ways. So finding inspiration in our religious heritage and the practice of agnosticism. So starting off with finding inspiration in our religious heritage. So I think we all have a religious heritage of some kind, but obviously it will vary a lot, not just in terms of different traditions, but also how far we've engaged with religious traditions, how far maybe our family did so. So by heritage, obviously, I mean mainly parents or other background and the kind of religious traditions those were engaged in. But sometimes also it can include adult experience, which has had an effect on us over time. So my own background is very much a Christian one. My father was a Baptist minister. So I was brought up in a very Baptist and liberal Baptist context. But from about the age of 19, I encountered Buddhism and got involved in Buddhism. So, that was 37 years ago. So I also have quite substantial adult experience, which has kind of shaped my sense of what my heritage is as well of Buddhism. So I often feel I have a dual heritage to work with, which is both Christian and Buddhist. So that's just an example, but for anybody else, but even if you kind of regard yourself as not religious, which is one of those difficult phrases, I think, because whether anybody can be not religious, but perhaps your parents rejected religion or felt they were not religious, and there was a rejection of religious dogmas, but still in that process of rejection, there's a relationship to a religious tradition, I think. It's still shaping the meanings that you have of religion. And of course, even if we didn't get religion at home, we might have got it at school and so on. So I think most of us have a religious heritage of some kind to work with. And then, of course, there's beyond the traditional bounds of what's considered religious, there's what were the archetypal meanings, what were the sources of inspiration, even if they were secular ones in your background, and maybe you can find those as well. So I think the thing is, even if we reject a religious heritage, religious meanings remain with us. So we still need the archetypal functions, and those heritage symbols are readily accessible to us to support those functions, even though we may adopt new ones. Yeah. So I mean, I certainly had to go through a process of rediscovering them, having basically rejected any kind of engagement with Christian symbols, such as Christ, for instance. Trying to engage with new ones in Buddhism, but then having to come back and realize that some of the stuff that was people were trying to do with those symbols, how they're working for people, so they overlapped with what I was working with in the new situation. So yeah, the meanings are still there. We can't escape religion so easily. And then, of course, there's all the issues around transplantation of symbols or functions, or conversion, perhaps even. So the transplantation of functions to a new context, taking on new symbols, is quite difficult, I think. I think I can say that from personal experience even. And where we've tried to kind of transplant our archetypal functions from one tradition to another, or beyond the tradition we started with at least, it may end up still being incomplete due to conflicts around those symbols. So if you, for example, try to take up a new set of symbols, and those are a bit alien, certainly at least at first, and that was the case for me with Buddhist symbols, that can end up creating more repression as you're trying to make yourself, as it were, believe in these new symbols. So conversion from one tradition to another is perhaps much harder than it might seem, because the meanings need to be transplanted, not just the beliefs. And to transplant the meanings, you need a whole new set of associations. So of course, it's quite easy to get a bit of a new set of associations, but then there are deeper ones and the more complex ones going back into the past, which may come back and do surprising things to you. So a pretty comprehensive new set of associations needs to override the previous ones for a full transplantation of archetypal functions to operate, perhaps. Okay, so that's a potential problem for converts. I'm not saying it's an insuperable problem, but it's one that shouldn't be underestimated. So it's just a particularly a problem for Western Buddhists, in my experience, but it might be the same for anybody who engages in tradition swapping, as it were. And that's deracination. I say deracination is the loss of roots. Yeah, beliefs adopted without a full background of meaning may lack the roots that they need to grow. And I think you can see that where people move to a new tradition, because it liberates them in a way. They find all sorts of new things, new resources, new possibilities in this new tradition. But they can then revert to absolutization in the new religion, and they may even be fundamentalist in their approach to it. And that when that happens, that I think that's probably very likely due to that sort of deracination, that they're not getting the wider context they need to have a live connection with the archetypal functions. Okay, so that's connecting with our religious heritage and some of the possible issues around it. But obviously, the main thing in practice there is looking back into your own experience, past experience, and finding positive connections with symbols that have an archetypal function for you. But then there's the more sort of critical aspect of that, which is what I call the practice of agnosticism. Now, agnosticism is one of the 5 principles of the Middle Way, which I've talked about in various contexts, and I've got a new book on those 5 principles coming out next year. And I'm hoping maybe to do some talks on those 5 principles next year as well. So whatever I say now, I'll follow up in more detail in the future, but I'll just say a little bit about the practice of agnosticism. So I think the practice of agnosticism is needed to help us avoid absolutizing the religious traditions we work with. And it's very easy to be overwhelmed, perhaps unexpectedly, by group absolutizations because they're so entrenched, particularly if you're talking about a group, a religious group, which strongly believes that these particular beliefs give meanings to their, central meaning to their lives. They're going to defend those beliefs if they feel challenged. So there's a sort of defensiveness which I think we need, practically speaking, practically necessary defensiveness to avoid being overwhelmed in that kind of context, to avoid being overwhelmed by the absolutizations in religion or indeed in other contexts. So the practice of agnosticism is that kind of pragmatic defensiveness, let's say. And I think that there are several elements to it. So perhaps the key one is even-handedness. So even-handedness is making a practice of criticizing both sides. Or at least having a critical perspective, let's say. You don't necessarily have to outwardly criticize, but just have a critical perspective on both sides of both opposed dogmas. So if for example, you don't believe that God exists, then there's an opposed dogma to that, which is the belief that God does not exist. And that's still in the same framework. So we need a critical perspective on both those opposed dogmas and the framework that they maintain. So that even-handedness obviously can get a bit negative or being mistaken for what some people, I think, particularly in the US, seem to now call both sidesism, or that's something of that kind, which can be unhelpful in certain ways. But yeah, it's more a question of being aware of both sides and of there being a critical perspective on both sides, so that you don't just accept the framework from which the dogmas have sprung, so that you are genuinely free of that framework. But there's also a positive side to even-handedness, I think, and that's celebrating helpful practices or resources on both sides. So for example, you can celebrate what's helpful in Christian tradition, and you can also celebrate what's helpful in atheist tradition, or secular tradition. The resources and the difficulties you find on both sides are not necessarily equal, and very often are very unequal. Yeah, but that doesn't remove the value of being aware of the limitations on both sides. So even if you were comparing an extremely fundamentalist group, which had a very negative effect on the world, like Islamic State or something, with the Quakers, some nice group, yeah, obviously they're not going to be equally weighted, but there are still going to be limitations on both sides. Agnosticism, I think, also requires that we be strong in the sense of not expecting final answers in the future, but rather reframing our approach to avoid expecting final answers. So we focus on development in experience rather than really whether or not there are any answers to anything. This kind of discourse on finding final answers seems to be part of the framework that maintains absolutization in religious traditions. But yeah, we don't need to know why the world exists or whatever. We're not going to know. And then finally, there are various kind of dirty tricks that are part of absolutizing. I'll mention these very briefly. So I call them appropriation, lumping, skeptical slippage, and unholy alliances. So these are all techniques which are used to maintain absolutizing views of things, and they're very, very common in religion. So appropriation, basically some kind of middle way or agnostic perspective is assumed to be part of the speaker's perspective. It's appropriated to an absolute perspective. So I once met a Christian monk, for example, who assured me that the middle way was all in Thomas Aquinas. And lumping is the other way. So where anything that tries to take up the middle way is lumped into the opposite camp is to be rejected. It's part of the other tribes approach. So those who think that what I'm saying now is atheism, for example, would be lumping it. Skeptical slippage is where you start off with a subtle agnostic position, but you slip into a negative position. So again, that's very common when people are reacting against religion. And unholy alliances is where both sides with an apparently opposed views, but the same framework, unite against the challenge coming from the middle. So sometimes you get, for example, theists and atheists uniting against any challenge to the metaphysical assumptions that maintain their framework. Okay, so I must stop there. But so hopefully those two areas can provide a bit of background to the practice focus, which I'll talk about more specifically in a short while. But I think they both need a bit of that kind of context. But yeah, obviously, when I introduce them in a short while, then it will be in a more sort of personal way, thinking about how we can apply them. Okay, but I'll stop there for now. And are there any questions or comments? I see we've got items in the chat. Ah, I slipped into the dark again, I'm told. Okay, I do have a light on here, so but I've got the sun right in my eyes, so unfortunately I can't really put myself in the sunlight.
I have a question, Robert. When you were talking about secularity, I had the impression that you were talking about it as meaning anti-religious. Is that correct? Okay, what if, what I'm thinking is, it was as if there was nothing outside of religion in the way you were presenting this, that you're either religious or your experience is somehow associated with it. And I was thinking of secularity kind of the way Charles Taylor talks about it, as a historical process through time that is not just anti-religious, it's connected with the culture and the so on of one's time. So do you see secularity as being something that has a wider potential meaning than simply anti-religious?
I do take your point about the other senses of secularity, yeah, particularly Charles Taylor's ones. So yeah, I mean, he talks about the separation of church and state and all that kind of thing, and just even the socio-political arrangements that allow that kind of separation, or allow us to really stand apart from traditions in any way. Yeah, you could see that as secular in a broad sense. So the fact that we're having this conversation and are not just ruled by the church and prevented from having it, is in some eyes, or in some senses, is a sign of secularity.
Okay.
Yeah, so I understand that there's that approach, but very often secularity involves not necessarily opposition to religion, but certainly the idea that something is not religious, and that's what I'm not sure about.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's about the difficulties with boundaries, and the fact that it ends up giving into that way that religion essentializes itself. So if you don't essentialize religion, then you end up with much more flexible boundaries.
Yeah. Okay.
And thus flexible boundaries around secularity as well. Yeah, it's a broader concept.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Susan.
Yeah, I would just add that I'm in a group where people are have very strong partiality to secularity, to a point where they want to name the group, instead of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, they want to include the word secular in it. And there's there are quite a few people who want to, and the institute is called the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, because they're extremely phobic about religious, well, even archetypes. It's limited to this very, very left-brained approach to Judaism, which being involved in the Middle Way Society has really opened up a lot more possibilities, and for personally, than I got in any of my training within that group, because there is a bias in reaction to the more traditional forms of Judaism. They've gone really far In the same way that the atheist society, there are groups that are, not middle way in both directions. So,
well, I think it's what I was thinking is that the anti-religiousness meaning of secularity is one of the meanings. And that there can be more going on in the kind of dimension of secularity in a society than it being anti-religious. But it sounds like that's what you're talking about, is an atheistic kind of horror, at religion.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the Stephen Batchelor approach to secularity is the idea that it's kind of means the world, and it's associated with the Latin word secular, meaning the world, which kind of encompasses everything. But if religion is already the world in a sense, or is a way of approaching the world, then it's difficult to kind of see what secularity means in that way, or how it's helpful to us. At least that's the difficulty I have with that approach. With secular Buddhism particularly. So if Buddhism is a religion and it doesn't have these fixed boundaries of religion, then it already, in the way we should be understanding it, encompasses what you might call secularity. So it seems kind of unnecessary to state that it's secular.
The only thing I'm worried about is the idea that there's nothing but religion. That you don't ever stand outside of a religious kind of experience of some kind. I think that's a problem too.
Well, I just see it as a dimension of human experience. So it's a bit like being historical or being geographical. So we have a location in space, so we're geographical. I wouldn't claim not to be geographical. And we have a location in time, and we are part of stories about what's happened through time. So we have a historical dimension, and we have a need to be inspired by archetypes as a human experience, which gives us a particular need for cultural traditions that enable or support that experience. So obviously much depends on understanding religion in that broader way, to seeing it as a dimension of human experience. But yes, if you associate religion with belief, then that's obviously likely to be problematic, but that's certainly not what I'm recommending. George?
Yeah, just you mentioned Stephen Batchelor, and from my understanding of what Stephen teaches with regard to a secular religion, it's where he seems to put forward that it's where you take a certain level of seriousness towards questions like, why am I here? The fact that we're going to die. And so these larger questions that people often are interested in, but it's putting them into a context where you take them very seriously. And it's that mindset that he seems to be suggesting is the religious aspect, which is maybe slightly different to what you're putting forward. That's how I understand it. So it'd be quite interesting to hear your thoughts in relation to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I wonder, William, what's meant by taking those questions seriously. I mean, if you can take them seriously in the sense of they have an experiential interpretation or an experiential dimension which we could explore. So, for instance, particularly, how do we feel about death, and what's our relationship with death, say? And that's a traditional religious motif and concern. But there's a distinction, I think, between that and seeking ultimate answers and expecting there to be ultimate answers. which is where we get into kind of projection territory. So yeah, that has been traditionally a religious concern, but it's very much, I think, a projected religious concern. But I mean, if you think about the ways that religious ritual might support people, for example, then something like relationship with death and the institution of funerals, these are vital for helping people adapt to death and to bereavement. And they do that, I think, by putting people in contact with a wider context through archetypal symbols. So if you have that kind of live religious inspiration, then it's much easier to deal with difficulties. So yeah, if that's what Stephen Batchelor means by seriousness, then that's great. It has a practical implication. It all depends how it's interpreted. But I've never really understood quite exactly what he meant by that remark. Any other thoughts? And Laura, you? No. No. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, then I'll go on to the practice focus. So yeah, there are 3 parts to this time. And they're not necessarily kind of a succession of stages in the same way as the previous practice focuses I've suggested have been a bit more like stages in meditations or stages in reflections. I think these are more 3 things you could do, but not necessarily at the same time or in the same session, as it were. But 3 areas for reflection, perhaps over the next month or so. So the first one is to reflect on your early experience of religion. Whatever that is. So it could be positive, could be very negative, or it could be an experience of absence of religion, or lack of engagement with religion, or rejection of religion. So whatever that experience is, are there archetypal symbols in that experience that you can relate to positively? So I think, first of all, for this all to be worth doing, we need to discover or maintain a positive relationship with religious symbols of some kind. And I suppose, there are many people who I've met for whom this is extremely difficult. I don't know if there are any of them here, but for example, somebody I met once who had a very pretty traumatic experience of Catholic education. So he was constantly reacting to religion ever since then. He hadn't got over it. So people in that kind of state, may be difficult to find any positives about the central symbols of the religion that they experienced. But perhaps you need to look there on the periphery. So if you were educated by strict nuns, for example, was there one nun who was helpful, amongst a lot of them? Or maybe you can relate to a saint rather than Jesus or whatever. Yeah, so those kinds of things possibly. But anyway, once you've found a positive symbol, I think it's good to celebrate it in the sense of, amplifying it a bit, and maybe find pictures that inspire you, read stories, maybe get out that dusty Bible, but selectively, and even reproduce them. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first thing. So engage positively with something from your early experience of religion. Second area of focus. So if you've rejected or become indifferent to those symbols, what were the reasons for doing so? So I'm suggesting that you try to just, again, this is kind of reflection on the past. Why exactly have you disengaged from religion, if that's what you've done? So try to track that process, and again, give it context. So by just becoming aware of that process and contextualizing it, hopefully you can separate objections to beliefs and arguments about beliefs from the role of the archetype in your experience. Okay, so first stage is positively engaging with religious symbols. Second stage is recalling your disengagement from it and contextualizing it. Third stage is the agnostic bit. So apply even-handed critical reflection to the religious symbols and to your response to them. So that means also being aware that that is not necessarily going to result in equal credit on both sides. Yeah, so it's not both sidesism in that sense. It's not saying that you didn't have very good reason for rejecting religion, for example, if you did. But yeah, reflecting on the limitations of justification on both sides. So this is all about contextualizing. Now, I think this third stage probably needs to take the form of pretty clear argument. Yeah, so this is really a critical thinking type process. So the clearer you can get it, the better. So you might like to write it down, for example. Written diary would be a really good way of doing it, maybe. And then you can look back at it, reconsider it, or maybe working with a discussion partner, somebody else who can give another context to it. Okay, so making a positive connection with religion, tracking your objections to it, and then thirdly, even-handed contextualization through critical reflection. Okay, so obviously all three of those stages, really, you need some sort of context for it to be a middle way practice. You need to engage with it in the spirit of trying to see the bigger picture. But you probably, you may not need to go through all of those three different points at the same time. You may want to work your way through them over a period of time, for example. Okay, so that's my suggestions for practice. Any queries?
One question. When you look at the when you're working on the even-handedness moment of this process, are you looking at both what you can celebrate and what you've rejected in an even-handed way? Yeah,
even-handed in the sense that you can see limitations in both perspectives, not in the sense that they are of equal value when considered.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions or thoughts?
Yes.
Yeah, Roy?
If there are several religious heritage, shall I select just two, or can I engage with more than two?
Wow, okay. Can you say more about what's your experience? Have you had sort of substantial engagement with 3 religious traditions?
Yes.
Right. I'm very interested if you can tell us more.
Okay, then I'll try to develop. Yes, okay. Yeah, I think especially the part of my grandmother is very special. So yes, then I'll try to engage with the 3. Okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's very unusual. That's all I could say. So, but yeah, that's obviously you do need to engage with whatever's relevant to you, and has had an effect on you.
Yes, because my grandmother has been the most important person in my life. So then,
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I mean, there's a something I've been reflecting on quite a lot myself is whether it's possible to be bi-religious, but whether it's possible to be tri-religious would be a further kind of aspect of that question. But because for me it often feels like keeping different balls in the air, so it's a sort of and switching back. There's obviously going to be some switching back and forth, but that's really characterized my relationship with Christianity and Buddhism in at least the last 5-7 years or so, since I've sort of tried to keep them both in circulation at the same time, as it were, and not commit myself to either of them unconditionally. And that seems to be working for me, but it's not particularly easy and can easily be misunderstood as well, I suppose, is my own experience. Susan.
Yeah, I just had the experience this week. I have to write something up for my humanist group about Ecclesiastes and the celebration of Sukkot, the holiday. And there's so much overlap, like the word, you see the word vanity all the time in Ecclesiastes, and it's hevel. It actually means impermanence. I mean, Abel, who was killed by Cain, it's the same word, and he wasn't there very long. It's really about impermanence, and Buddhism and Judaism in this case, and it's the wisdom tradition in Ecclesiastes, which is universal across, within all Christianity and Judaism, and probably Islam. I don't know enough about Islam. There is the wisdom literature, which is quite universal. And it works really well to have the vocabulary of Buddhism to go with the analysis of Ecclesiastes and impermanence. So, but my problem is, in Judaism, everything is the word. There's so little symbolism. It's very, in fact, I'm in a Torah study group every week, and the people in the group, it's interfaith, and it's also within Judaism, from the most extreme Orthodox to extreme atheists. And we have this great discussion, and it's, what was I going to say? There are just so many different approaches. Oh, I know, the rabbi who led it, we take turns leading it. The rabbi who led it said, this is what someone once told me this, a rabbi, Jews don't take up the sword, SWORD, not really ever. And they're not really in power in the world. So you cross off the S and you cross off the L and it's the word, you know. And she just brought that up, and I thought, wow, yeah, that's true. So Torah study, it's about it's reading. We read, you know, every week, it's whichever portion you read that week. You go through the whole thing and you start over again. And you interpret the stories in different ways, but the symbols, it's more the narrative and the different approaches to the narrative. And there's very little, I mean, Moses came up as a symbol this past time, which was kind of interesting, as a poignant, you know, kind of symbol of you never really make it to the promised land. You just keep trying and work your, you know, and that was very nice. But very little, I mean, the archetype, finding archetypes is not easy for me, you know.
Well,
Maybe,
there are loads of them in the Hebrew
cloud.
Bible, aren't there? But yeah, it's all in the stories, as you say.
Yeah.
But yeah, but also I think it's important not to draw too hard and fast a distinction between sort of words and symbols, because or words and visual symbols. So words can operate like visual symbols in some ways, and visual symbols sometimes operate like words. So we've got this distinction between a concept and a symbol that I think often gets too rigid. So as I was saying earlier, that concepts can work in a very archetypal fashion. So if you think of the use of the word truth, particularly for a lot of people,
or Hevel, you know, impermanence.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, but I mean, also what you were saying put me in mind of the importance of kind of using comparisons between religious traditions in a sort of helpful way to, well, a way it's related to practice, I guess. So if you can see a practical relationship, then you don't have to make sort of big claims about how they're really saying the same thing in order to use them in the same way. I mean, that's why I think that when I want to talk about functions of archetypes, and in that way you can avoid a lot of vague syncretism, where people make big, vague claims about how all religions are one, how things are all the same in different religious contexts and so on, when clearly they're not in many cases. Yeah, so as long as you keep bringing it back to its relationship to a practice, I think that's can guard against some of the sins of overambitious syncretism. But okay, any sort of final questions or thoughts? I've got a few minutes left. We have got a few minutes.
I just wanted to say that I understood much more clearly about the idea of religion perhaps being seen as this sort of all-encompassing context when you explained that it's really what we're talking about are archetypes, that religion is can be looked at through that lens. So that was really helpful to me. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the root of that set me off on that line of thinking was very much Jung saying that, religion is the expression of the archetypes. And although I'm not, fully satisfied with that statement, I still think it was incredibly rich as a line of thinking, setting one off on the line of thinking.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we bring things to a close then. And so there'll be, as usual, I think there'll be a follow-up in a couple of weeks. Yeah. The next session will be 4th of September, I think. when I'll be talking about the hero. So we're going to work our way through the 4 major archetypes, and also the middle way as the 5th one at the end. Okay. I will be connecting from holiday in Ireland, but I'm told there is Wi-Fi there, so I'm hoping to go ahead in the same way as usual, and that there won't be any problems. If they turn out to be there, that will be the reason for them. Okay. Anyway,
Thank you.
yes, I hope to see you in a month's time.
Yes. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.